Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Philip Khoury, and I have the great privilege of chairing the Emile Bustani Middle East Seminar at MIT. We're in our 36th year, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the Bustani family and Mrs. Myrna Bustani in particular, who has supported this seminar all these many years. And we're so grateful to her, in particular, Myrna. She created this seminar at MIT in memory and honor of her father, an enormous figure in the world of Middle East commerce, industry, construction, and politics, and who passed away in a tragic accident in 1963 and was an alumnus of MIT, class of 1933, that is. I'm really pleased that Dr. Sara Roy is with us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I've had also the privilege of knowing Sara really from her school days being her university days at Harvard, where she got all her degrees there from her undergraduate right through her doctorate. She is today Senior Research Scholar and Associate Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard, and she co-chairs the Middle East Seminar at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Center for Middle East Studies, both at Harvard, of course. She's had a lot of very varied professional experiences with different agencies, USAID, UNCTAD, UNIDO, and others. She serves on a number of boards concerned with Gaza, with Mental Health Foundation, with the American Near East Refugee Aid, and others. And she's won a number of grants and awards, as you might expect. And she's the author of 5 books that she authored herself. And one just came out this year titled Unsilencing Gaza, Reflections on Resistance. Second is Hamas and Civil Society in Gaza, Engaging the Islamic Social Sector. The third is Failing Peace, Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. The fourth is the Gaza Strip, the Political Economy of De-Development, and also the Economics of Middle East Peace, a reassessment, which she was the editor of. So she's had her pen has hardly run dry. So Sara is going to really reflect today. Her title is Gaza, Reflections on Decades of Research, and we'll come to that in just a moment, but I want to make sure that I am going over the protocols for this meeting, and so let me just say this. After Sara's talk, we will take questions using the Q&A function of Zoom, which you could open by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to add questions during the talk and afterward. Please do not use the chat function to submit questions, only the Q&A function. And questions will be answered after Sara's talk concludes. And if at any point in time you need technical assistance, please use the chat function to let our producer and technical assistant know. They're going to try their best to help you. So we really hope you'll enjoy Sara's lecture. Sara Roy.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip, very much for the invitation to address the seminar. Again, I've always enjoyed doing so and deeply appreciate the opportunity. I also want to apologize to everyone up front for my very raspy voice. I'm apparently fighting a sore throat and a cold, so please bear with me. All right, well, in thinking about this talk, I decided that I did not want to focus on the grave conditions in Gaza, which I assume many of you are aware of. Rather, I want to reflect on some of what I've learned in my near 4 decades of research in Gaza. This is a huge topic, which I cannot cover fully, but hope to explore in greater detail in subsequent writings. Here I shall focus on some reflections and themes that have run through my work, and that speak not only to where Gaza is, but how it got there and why. I shall begin with a story, one that I've written about before, but it bears retelling. It was the summer of 1985 during my very first visit to Gaza. I was taken on a tour of the area by a woman who would become a dear friend named Alia. As we drove along Gaza's coastal road, I saw an elderly Palestinian man standing at the shoreline with some boxes of oranges next to him. I was puzzled by this and asked Alia to stop the car. One by one, the elderly Palestinian took an orange and threw it into the sea. His was not an action of playfulness, but of pain and regret. His movements were slow and labored, as if the weight of each orange was more than he could bear. Not understanding what I was seeing, I asked Alia why he was doing this, and she explained that he'd been prevented from exporting his oranges to Israel, and rather than watch them rot in his orchards, the old man chose to cast them into the sea. I've never forgotten this scene, now over 36 years ago, and the impact it had on me. Nearly 40 years later, after peace agreements, economic protocols, roadmaps, so-called disengagements, donor conferences, reconciliation attempts, airports and seaports, and proposals for offshore artificial islands, Gazans are still casting their oranges into the sea. Yet Gaza is no longer where I found it so long ago, but it is someplace far worse. Gaza's trajectory over the last 54 years has taken it from a politically and economically integrated territory to an isolated enclave, from a relatively functional economy to a dysfunctional one, from a productive society to an impoverished one, and from people with nationalist claims to a humanitarian problem where most men, women, and children now require some form of humanitarian assistance to sustain themselves. These damaging transformations, among others, have become formalized and permanent, shaping a future that is both partial and disfigured. What is happening to Gaza is catastrophic. It is also deliberate, conscious, and planned. In my early research, I was primarily concerned with the occupation and its economic impact on the Gaza Strip because it was the economy that so starkly and unsparingly illustrated the profound inequities that form the structural and philosophical core of occupation policy. My initial focus on the economy stemmed from the profound shock and confusion I felt when I first lived in Gaza over 35 years ago. The chasm between what I had been taught and what I encountered in Israel's treatment of the Palestinians stunned me. As an American Jew growing up in the 1960s and 70s and educated in elite schools, I was told, often implicitly, to believe and never question Israeli beneficence and morality and Arab incompetence and incivility. Although my parents taught me to think critically and often provided much needed counterpoints, the intellectual and political weight of the times was difficult to cast aside. There was little, if any, context for speaking critically about Israel or sympathetically or ethically about Arabs, who were forbidden, as we were, to embrace the word Palestine or Palestinian. Although I had visited Israel many times during my childhood, my first visit to the West Bank and Gaza occurred, as I said, in the summer of 1985. I traveled there against the protestations of the Israeli part of my family to conduct fieldwork for my doctoral dissertation, which examined an American program of bilateral economic assistance to the Palestinians. My thesis asked whether economic development was possible under conditions of military occupation, and my search for an answer immersed me in a reality, indeed a world, I was totally unaware of and unprepared for. As a well-trained graduate student, I felt I understood the political complexities of the area, the actors involved, their histories, and the many arguments and sides of the conflict. I went, I believed, with a critical but open mind. I went, I believe, prepared for anything. In that, I was wrong. Those first months in Gaza and the West Bank changed my life. I distinctly remember the day I first entered Gaza. I had been in the West Bank for some time and had acquired some familiarity with the people and the region and felt comfortable living there despite the harshness of the occupation. However, the thought of living in the Gaza Strip made me nervous, even scared. I had heard terrible and frightening stories about Gaza and its people, especially from my Israeli friends and family. I was taken to the Marna House, which was then one of only 2 hotels in the Gaza Strip, and I was told the best, I read the safest, place for foreigners to stay. The hotel was managed by Alia Shawa, who belonged to one of Gaza's oldest and wealthiest families, and who, as I said earlier, would become one of my dearest friends. Alia welcomed me, but clearly viewed me with some suspicion. After all, why would an American be visiting Gaza? The implicit answer was obvious. And when she learned I was Jewish, her concern and my anxiety grew. In those days, prior to the first Palestinian uprising, which began in December of 1987, one of the first questions I was often asked by Gazans was, "Are you a Christian?" I never lied and told everyone who asked that I was Jewish. To my surprise, it was not fear or anger I typically encountered when people learned I was Jewish, but shock, suspicion, some confusion, and considerable curiosity. I took advantage of their curiosity and my somewhat unique status to begin a discussion of why I was there, explaining that I had come to Gaza to learn about its economy, people, society, and history, and about military occupation and how it affects their lives. I thought it would take a long time to gain their trust, but again, I was wrong. Within 1 week of arriving in Gaza, I was immersed in local life in a manner I could not possibly have foreseen, taken from one end of the strip to the other by people I barely knew, but whom Alia initially vetted. I entered areas seldom, if ever, seen by foreigners, helped by people whose support and encouragement would have been unimaginable to me just days before. Many of those same people would later risk their lives to help me collect data during the first Palestinian uprising for my book on the political economy of de-development. I was invited into homes, both rich and poor, where no request was too great or question too burdensome. Not only did my being Jewish cease to be a source of concern, it actually became an asset. People could not do enough to help me. Although I could not possibly have known it at the time, the summer of 1985 set the stage for the next decades of my life. The injustice of the occupation and the inability of Palestinians to defend themselves against it affected me deeply. My research among them was not only a matter of scholarship, it went to the core of who I was, where I came from, the meaning of my Judaism, my identity as a child of Holocaust survivors, my relationship with Israel, and the nature and purpose of my work. One of the most troubling and frightening aspects of the occupation during my initial encounter with it was its mundane, prosaic nature. For Palestinians, occupation was the ordinary, a way of life that had to be lived defensively, without recourse or appeal, without protection or choice, largely absent of accountability, predictability, rationality, or control. Furthermore, the distortion of Palestinian life remained unquestioned by those beyond it, for whom the realities of occupation were wholly unknown. What was for Palestinians a narrative of crisis, of territorial dispossession and displacement, was for others an example of benign and legitimate control. It is this absence of context and its continued mystification that my research has always sought to address. From my earliest time in Gaza, the underlying impulse of my work has always been towards society, women, children, families, neighborhoods, and communities. I focus not only on the occupation's destructive impact on people, but on how they, whether as individuals or communities, were able to resist it and maintain a meaningful way of life. The strength of Gaza's people amazed me, and it still does, a topic that has received far too little attention in the literature on the conflict. My most powerful experiences in Gaza and the most poignant memories I have are not of violence or despair, but of kindness and generosity, creativity and determination, the qualities that drew me to the people of Gaza from the very beginning. Society in Gaza has long struggled to remain whole and humane, despite the immense and largely unabated pressures imposed upon it. Pressures that in the last 15 years have assumed new dimensions of cruelty, which have impoverished and imprisoned Gaza's people, denying them the right to live as we do, to work, to plan, to contemplate an ordinary and productive life, to live with possibility and dignity. In other lectures and writings, I have examined in detail some key paradigm shifts in the way the conflict and Palestinians are perceived and treated. Here I will briefly highlight 4 of the most important of these shifts because they have had a damaging and defining impact on Gaza and provide a critical framework within which to understand some of the themes I shall subsequently discuss. The first paradigm shift concerns the belief that occupation is reversible and should be reversed, which was largely unquestioned and uncontested, and was the catalyzing force behind many social, political, and economic initiatives. This belief that the occupation and the forces that sustain it can and should be stopped was long ago reversed and is powerfully illustrated in the formalization and acceptance by Israel and key members of the international donor community of Palestinian territorial and demographic fragmentation, division, and isolation. Within this framework established by Oslo, Gaza and the West Bank were separated demographically and geographically. As a result, a largely isolated Gaza came to be seen as exceptional or marginal, existing outside a Palestinian state and a Palestinian nation. This in turn supports Israel's strategic interest to thwart any political settlement that treats Gaza, the Gaza Strip and West Bank as one entity, thereby preserving Palestinian division. The policies that have come to define Gaza as exceptional are simply extensions, albeit more extreme, of policies long used to separate and isolate Palestinians in the West Bank and in Israel. In this regard, Gaza's status is part of a long and consistent policy continuum of containment, removal, and now erasure. As such, Gaza became the model for the fragmentation of the West Bank into small, disconnected enclaves under constant assault. Hence, it is important to understand that these policies of separation and exclusion make it difficult, if not impossible, for Palestinians to imagine a larger sense of a collective. And without that sense, exclusion becomes the defining basis for politics and policy. In fact, given the years of separation and division of Gaza and the West Bank and the consistent failure to achieve reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, a local analyst writes that there is a growing feeling among some segments of Palestinian society that the Gaza Strip must seriously consider finding exits from the humanitarian crisis that include an independent Gaza entity. Hamas also sees the division as a way of stabilizing and maintaining its control over Gaza, and as some analysts have argued, as a springboard for extending its control into the West Bank. Israel has long pursued this division, which is one reason Israel continues to impose the blockade and why Israel also allows humanitarian relief and monies into Gaza. Critically, the occupation, which now includes the damaging 15-year blockade, has long remained unchallenged by an international, largely Western order. Hence, in the absence of meaningful legal and political pressure from the West, the presence of the Israeli army on Palestinian territory and military assaults against Palestinians, especially in Gaza, remain unopposed. Indeed, after the May 2021 hostilities, the new Israeli government announced that it would continue the blockade of Gaza and prevent the reconstruction process. However, in order to avert another conflagration and under pressure from the US in particular, the Israeli government announced some measures to ease conditions in Gaza, including an increase in the number of work permits for Palestinians working in Israel, which would include several thousand Gazans, and allowing the entry of Qatari money for grants of humanitarian aid, totaling around $100 per month per recipient. Israel also said it would allow the entry of more building and other materials and widening the fishing zone. However, the blockade remains in place. This points to a second paradigm shift. Prior to Oslo, there was a belief among Israelis and within the international community generally that peace and occupation were incompatible. The former could not be achieved in the presence of the latter. This too has changed. Peace and occupation are now considered compatible, arguably complementary, as seen most recently in the Abraham Accords, the so-called peace agreements between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, and in an expanding settlement enterprise, which is now considered vital to the protection and security of Israelis. Hence, Palestine's effective dismemberment and the permanence of territorial fragmentation and division are accepted by key members of the international community as legitimate and benign and totally manageable. This reality, to which the international community has largely acceded, is further characterized by a willingness to legitimize Israel's occupation as long as there is no accepted agreement to end it. Excuse me. In this way, the occupation was transformed from a political and legal issue with international legitimacy into a simple dispute over borders where the rules of war apply rather than those of occupation. This is the third paradigm shift. This recasting from occupation to war is acutely clear and defining in Israel's relationship with Gaza, and was made easier after Hamas's 2006 election victory and 2007 takeover of the Gaza Strip, a recasting the international community has largely come to accept, if not embrace. Henceforth, Gaza was identified solely with Hamas and therefore as hostile and alien. The growing inapplicability of occupation as an analytical and legal framework introduces a fourth paradigm shift regarding Israeli policy towards the Palestinians and their territory. In the West Bank, this shift in Israeli policy is away from occupation towards annexation and imposed sovereignty. In Gaza, the shift in Israeli policy moved from one that sought to control and dominate the Palestinian economy, shaping it to Israel's own interest, to one that undermines and ruins the economy through the imposition of a blockade, which is really an intensified military closure. It should be said also that some form of closure has been in effect in Gaza since 1991 and formalized in 1993. The closure on Gaza has never been lifted. What is subject to change is the intensity of the closure, and the blockade, of course, represents its most extreme expression. Perhaps most striking of all, the ruination of Gaza's economy has transformed Palestinians from a people with national, political, and economic rights into a weakened community dependent on humanitarian assistance, for whom the international community is wholly responsible and has long been. It is no longer, and in fact has not been for quite a long time, a question of economic growth, change or reform, freedom or liberation, but of essential humanitarian needs, of reducing the needs and rights of over 2 million people in Gaza to an exercise in counting calories and truckloads of food. Is it correct to say, therefore, that humanitarianism has now become an instrument of the military? The deliberate reduction of Palestinians to a humanitarian issue, deprived and by extension undeserving of political and economic rights, and dependent on the international community for sustenance, positions relief, not progress, as the primary, if not only, political option for Gaza. As such, humanitarianism has come to define the way the international community interacts with Palestinians, who are made irrelevant and disposable as political and national actors, in effect invalidated. In this way, Israel and the West maintain a humanitarian problem to manage a political one, in this case, subduing an undesirable and inconvenient population. A senior official at the Israeli human rights organization, Gisha, that monitors conditions in Gaza, distilled Israel's approach. And here I quote, "In the rest of the world, we try to bring people up to the humanitarian standard. Gaza is the only place where we're trying to push them down. to keep them at the lowest possible indicators. In this way, humanitarian aid is used not only to meet the rapidly expanding needs of an increasingly impoverished population, but is also used to prolong conflict and suffering. If a policy exists, it is one of not finding solutions. The resulting context has proved increasingly resistant to testimony, evidence, and fact, assigning little, if any, value to them. And this raises the question of what more can be done to move, to change, and make a difference. Consequently, over time, the occupation has deepened and assumed a particularly destructive quality. In Gaza, the occupation is meant to prevent any kind of normal environment from emerging, institutionalizing in both practical and psychological terms a form of abnormality that resists change the longer it is allowed to last and take shape. This abnormality is rooted fundamentally in cutting most of Gaza's ties to the outside world. For example, young people in Gaza have no conception, or very little, if any conception, I should say, of the world beyond Gaza. They do not know what it means to board a plane or a ship or even a train. The withdrawal of law and with it justice in Gaza, combined with economic collapse, has not only necessitated humanitarian intervention, but has also situated Gaza between periodic conflict and potential catastrophe, as a colleague of mine put it. In a context where catastrophe has in effect become a form of governance, resistance becomes disarrayed, leading to a crisis of how to resist. Hence, Israel rules by maintaining a liminal, indeterminate state where the sites of resistance are narrow and ineffective. And as my colleague put it, quote, Israel governs by how near to the disaster threshold Gaza is allowed to go, end quote. Within this mode of rule, Palestinians are regarded as terrorists or charity cases, where relief assistance is now treated as a salary. In this regard, some local economists have argued that Gaza is in a state of post-collapse. Israel's objective in Gaza, therefore, is limited and contained. To avert any large-scale disaster, such as starvation, which is a new and terrible metric, Gaza is controlled by the threat of wholesale calamity, be it hunger, institutional destruction, or continued economic demise, where suffering has become a legitimate instrument of control. One must ask, how are division and separation embodied in the Palestinian experience and in the Israeli experience as well? Now, having articulated a framework based on these paradigm shifts, I'd like to turn now to some of the prominent themes in my research. The first one I'd like to address is the nature of violence. And again, I cannot go into great detail about all of these, but hopefully can cover some of the most important points. By the nature of violence, I mean what constitutes violence in the Palestinian context. The pressures on the population are immense and unrelenting and include high levels of unemployment and impoverishment, considerable infrastructural damage and destruction, and environmental degradation, where it is no exaggeration to say that Gaza's water and soil are dangerously contaminated, what one scientist referred to as a toxic ecology or biosphere of war. This is a topic that requires a great deal more research. Hence, violence in Gaza is not only or even primarily defined in militaristic terms, but in prosaic ones, in everyday, ordinary acts: the absence of clean water, insufficient supplies of electricity, the struggle to find a job, the struggle to feed one's children, accessing schools safely, reaching a hospital, even burying a loved one. And can humanitarianism itself be considered a form of violence? That is, keeping people alive through subventions while they are being impoverished and attacked. By operating in an environment, excuse me, where the emergency is not temporary, but permanent, and through the aid provided by the humanitarian community, which is clearly needed, the occupier is able to enforce and sustain oppression. In this regard, when donors speak of restoring Gaza to a state of pre-conflict, they reveal a fundamental, if not cynical, misunderstanding of life in Gaza and always have. Gaza has never truly enjoyed a state without conflict or violence, broadly defined. Gaza exists in a state of perpetual conflict, where quiet is not the absence of conflict, nor is it peace. Defining it as such, as the international community has often done, introduces yet another distortion into Gaza's lived reality. Similarly, nothing in Gaza is post-trauma, and such a definition ignores the nature of trauma among Palestinians, especially in Gaza. Minimally, 10% of the population, well over 200,000 people, need serious mental health intervention according to the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. The intergenerational impact of trauma on both an individual and societal level is not to be underestimated. The second theme I want to address is the failure by Israel and the West to connect Palestinian actions, both violent and nonviolent, with underlying conditions of impoverishment and desperation. This failure, born of political interest and racism, has been consistent throughout my experience, even during major assaults on Gaza. As far as Gaza is concerned, the blockade, as I said earlier, is now an accepted, if not largely unquestioned and institutionalized part of the occupation in Gaza. The 15-year blockade has proved to be one of the most destructive measures imposed on society and economy. By 2016, for example, less than 10% of the homes destroyed in the 2014 summer assault known as Operation Protective Edge had been rebuilt because of restrictions on the entry of building materials. Referring to the damage inflicted during the May 2021 hostilities, the Middle East director of the International Committee of the Red Cross stated, quote, "The damage inflicted in less than 2 weeks will take years, if not decades, to rebuild," end quote. The blockade is not about toppling the Hamas regime, as stated by the Israeli government. It is about exactly the opposite, maintaining the division and separation of the two territories by containing Hamas within Gaza under Israeli control and immiserating Gaza's people, society, and economy so that Gaza remains removed from any future political equation or resolution, thereby ensuring that no viable Palestinian state or political construct can emerge. Social problems which arise from poverty and discrimination are described in terms of culture or religion or nationalism and are treated as terrorism. The larger objective, of course, is to marginalize Palestinians and their rights and claims. As one Palestinian scholar put it, Palestinians have come to be viewed as present absentees in Israeli eyes, and I might add, in official American and European eyes, as a provocation to the state. Excuse me. The next theme concerns dehumanization. If there is one theme over my decades of research that is the strongest and most consistent and unrelenting, it is the dehumanization of Palestinians, primarily by Israelis, but also by American and European officials and other Arabs. This dynamic has not changed in my long experience, and it finds a range of expressions from the more benign, relatively speaking, a kind of disdainful tolerance, to the more pernicious, condoned erasure, where entire families in Gaza are, according to the Israeli journalist Amir Haas, now being targeted and killed. The question remains, why has the international community remained silent or failed to respond in any humane manner? A friend in Gaza wanted me to share the following with you. Excuse me. It speaks to a more subtle form of dehumanization or degradation that is also harmful and damaging. My friend is a young professional woman who works for an American NGO. Talking about the 11-day assault on Gaza last May, she said, quote, "We all had lived through terrible days. It was so terrifying. When it ended, my boss told me and the other Palestinian employees to return to work immediately, just one day after the aggression ended. When we asked for some more time to grieve and recover and to process what we had been through, he responded by saying, 'At least you have a job.' I felt like we were all commodities, as if we were cheap, where suffering and resilience are expected. We are not allowed any space to navigate exhaustion. It was really painful." "Did you return to work the next day?" I asked. "Yes, of course," she said. "I need the job." I would like to read an excerpt from my recent book on silence in Gaza. I devote 2 chapters of the book to looking back at Gaza in the early days of my research. What follows is based on field notes I kept during the first Intifada in 1988 and 89, when my husband and I lived in Gaza. In this excerpt, I describe acts of humiliation by the Israeli army, which were common and widespread. These acts typically involved beating and otherwise humiliating women and children, especially in public and private spaces. And while I cannot say this was an official policy of the IDF, I can say it was a pattern of behavior that, while aberrant, was purposeful, recurring throughout my time in Gaza that year. The most disturbing aspect of these beatings was a tacit understanding the soldiers had managed to impose on the population. "We will beat your women and children. We will stop beating your women and children if you beat them." I do not know how this understanding was formed. All I know is that Palestinians responded in a way that was meant to mitigate harm and eliminate the possibility of greater violence. Teachers told stories of how soldiers would enter classrooms and begin hitting some of the children, knowing that the only way to get rid of the soldiers was to take over. Teachers would start slapping the children until the soldiers would leave. They would then comfort the children and try to distract them with play. A friend of mine at the time, a foreign diplomat who worked for UNRWA as a refugee affairs officer, told me she saw soldiers dragging a 15-year-old girl up some stairs before beating her. The Palestinian driver of her car went over to the girl and started to hit her, at which point the soldiers left. "Why do you think this is happening?" I asked. She answered, "To perpetuate a cycle of violence within Palestinian society, thereby breaking the bonds that hold families and society together, something Palestinians clearly understood and resisted." The beatings, of course, also were intended to humiliate and demean men, all men, not just those related to the woman or child being attacked, but those witnessing the assault and powerless to defend against it. The beatings were designed to instill submission more than fear, and for a time they failed to do so, which is why they recurred. Today, the situation is far worse, but the goal, as I have come to understand it, remains unchanged: to make Palestinians believe in their own worthlessness and make others believe in it as well. As some of my friends in Gaza fear, nothing we can do will prevent our children from coming to the same end. They also argue that the question of who counts, that is, in their view, Palestinians do not count as human beings, is not the only question that must be asked. The other question is, how do they count? For many of my friends, Palestinians matter only as subjects on which new military technologies are being tested and sold. This is a common belief in Gaza, as is the sense of abandonment that no one, including their own leadership, both Fatah and Hamas, is accountable for or cares about Palestinian suffering. Palestinians in Gaza truly believe that they are on their own, As I wrote in my statement before the UN Security Council following the 2014 summer assault, people in Gaza now finally believe Israelis when they say there are no civilians in Gaza. Yet Palestinians are still shocked at the dehumanizing manner with which they are treated. Their sense of disbelief and incredulity remain. The next theme concerns the present versus the future. Perhaps one of the saddest changes I have witnessed over the last 3 decades is a belief that the future will only bring greater suffering than the present. The contrast with the first Intifada is striking. Then people truly believed that a better future was not only possible, but attainable and organized around that belief. Today, as one friend in his 20s, young man, recently told me, quote, "It is a crime to think about things improving. It is a crime even to think about things staying the same." End quote. So diminished, people live their lives with whatever they have according to deprivation and scarcity. Having enough food, clothing, or electricity have been elevated to an aspiration. Many of my friends organize their day according to when they have electricity. There is no interest or energy to think about much else, let alone larger political or national issues. Another colleague, a highly educated woman and mother of 2 young children, told me that no one thinks about Jerusalem or the right of return anymore, but about finding a job and feeding their families. One young refugee said, "My dream is to see a concrete slab as my roof." The craving is not for a homeland, and the fear is not its absence. The craving is for a livelihood, no matter how meager, clean water and sanctuary, and the fear is that they are unattainable. In a recent conversation with another friend and colleague, he described the attenuation of life in this way, quote, "We do not even think about jobs anymore. All we think about is electricity and when we will have it," end quote. The constriction of life and the individual and collective accommodation to it has been accompanied, understandably, by a detachment from politics and an absence of demands beyond those that are immediate, narrow, and basic to survival. In this regard, my young female friend, whom I quoted earlier, also told me, quote, "My friends and I ask ourselves, do we know what we are passionate about? What is passion when you are in survival mode? There are no solutions, so we just talk. Do you know what it means when you cannot imagine life outside Gaza or inside it? We live with what we are given." End quote. Palestinians emphasize their existence, but it no longer seems connected to a larger context of national liberation as it once was. Hence, the increasing difficulty of people to connect as indigenous to their own land. In Gaza, this is expressed in rising levels of emigration. The dream is to leave Gaza, many of my friends tell me. The director of a local human rights organization in Gaza put it this way: "This," referring to emigration, "is a new, smarter Nakba. It's slow, but it's very much in progress. How did Palestinians get pushed to the point where its youth are willing to pay to leave? The whole point of our struggle used to be about coming back," end quote. In this way, Israel has achieved through economic deprivation what its government once called economic warfare, what it failed to do through limited economic prosperity during the first 2 decades of occupation. And that is to compel Palestinians to turn away from their national and political aspirations. And here I want to introduce the next theme, which is the permeation of loss and the waning of deterrence. Simply put, Palestinians in Gaza have reached a point, in fact, I believe it was reached some time ago, where they feel they have little, if anything, left to lose. This sense is not only measured materially, but more so, in my view, psychologically, where more destruction does not inflict appreciably more pain. This sense of loss was particularly pronounced following the summer 2014 assault. My last trip to Gaza was in the fall of 2016, and my observations from that trip were published in an article in the London Review of Books, where I asked, what more can Israel inflict when the loss of entire families is now a daily topic of conversation? End quote. And as one Israeli analyst put it, this sense of having nothing left to lose is also true of Hamas, where continued material losses have reached a point of saturation with little, if any, added pain. In this context, Israel's deterrence policy, he argues, carries little, if any, weight, which strengthens Hamas's strategic position. I would also add here that although many, perhaps most, Palestinians in Gaza criticize, if not condemn, Hamas's governance and ideology, there has been continuous support for its central role in resistance. What is most concerning, in my view, is that even with the infusion of aid or increased levels of economic assistance to Gaza, what some donors erroneously called development assistance, little will change in the continued presence of the blockade and the occupation. The next theme, I'm almost done. I refer to removing Gaza from the sphere of politics. For now, Gaza has been largely removed from the sphere of politics. Relief is the primary, if only, choice left. Is Gaza a template for a new politics of exclusion that can be found in other contexts? And here I borrow from a recent essay I co-authored with a colleague and friends. We write, quote, Gaza, of course, is an extreme case, but there are similar situations developing around the world, other places of inattention. In the US, for example, making America great again still goes hand in hand with sending people back to where they came from, where they will remain unseen. Similarly, millions are kept in refugee camps in Turkey, Libya, or Europe itself, with very little prospect of leaving or earning a living. Families are kept for years in camps, caught between the hope of an improbable asylum in Europe and the fear of being sent back. They are increasingly seen as a nuisance to be contained and isolated rather than welcomed and integrated. They are the European versions of Gaza without the bombing. Mini Gazas are developing around the world, from Gaza to Lesbos, from Lesbos to Afghanistan and beyond. Sites of exception are growing where people are barred from legitimate political discourse, unrecognized but kept alive, without claim to community or nationhood, where the principal aim of politics is to control unwanted populations with no vision of anything but further control. And what then? It is often difficult to end a presentation on Gaza and Israel-Palestine on a positive note, but there are positives, and I shall conclude with one. Excuse me. And this is the last theme I'll discuss, which I term Palestine as an idea. In a recent webinar I attended, one speaker asked the question, what is Palestine? Is it a place, a country, a site of desire, a site of return, an idea? He argued that the Palestinian struggle has been globalized via the internet and incorporated into other struggles like Black Lives Matter. The global feeling for Palestine, for what Palestine stands for, he continued, speaks to the idea of Palestine as a struggle against injustice and for justice, as defiance and steadfastness. In this way, the idea of Palestine, like that of Black Lives Matter, means something as it speaks to power, not only or even in binary terms, but in larger conceptual terms, such as justice. In my long engagement with Israel-Palestine, I have seen a great deal of change, much of it negative, but also positive. I very much agree that Palestine has come to stand for an idea and not just a place, and I believe this will continue to grow. What has also changed for the better, and dramatically so, is the expanding space for a counter-narrative, for asking different kinds of questions, and for understanding Palestinians and Israelis outside the binary straitjackets in which they have often been placed. The changes within the progressive Jewish community, in particular, over the last 2 decades have been striking. And in the long run, these changes can only benefit both peoples. And as I've also seen, there are fewer forms of counterattack, although the attacks do continue. In my ongoing discussions with friends and colleagues in Palestine, several things are clear. Palestinians refuse to believe that they belong where Israel and the West have placed them, that what they are facing is a result of what they have done, to borrow from James Baldwin. It has also become clear that for more and more Palestinians, it is not Jewish sovereignty per se that they object to, but Jewish supremacy. And this leads to my last point. The situation in Palestine is tragic. Yet as certain political options erode, such as 2 states, and are extinguished by facts on the ground, support for a rights-based approach grows stronger. Gaza cannot be marginalized, nor can the Palestinian issue, and neither will disappear. Ultimately, the resolution to this tragic conflict lies in equal rights for all people, Israeli and Palestinian. Thank you.